And now it's time for our morning keynote speaker. And I am more than delighted to introduce to you the Reverend Young Me Morris, who will reflect on what it's like and what it means to our world to love the people whom we might find to be unlovable. The unhoused. She's been chaplain to the unhoused and a pastor to congregations. So we will hear a message from the Reverend Young Me Morris. And so please.
Good morning. Boy, we've heard a lot already, so how about I lead you first through a breathing exercise. How about that? I do this in my church, where I invite you to uncross your legs and your ankles and plant both feet firmly on the floor and find that sweet spot for your tail in your chairs. And turn your palms facing upward in your lap if that helps you, and close your eyes if that helps you. And now take in a deep cleansing breath. Inhale all the way to the top of your lungs, and exhale and squeeze all that oxygen out. And again, inhale all the way to the top, and exhale all the way out. And on your next inhale, I invite you to roll your shoulders up to your earlobes and then to the back of the room, and exhale your shoulders down. Do that again. Roll it up, inhale, exhale down, and one last time. Inhale up to the back of the room and exhale down, and leave your body in this open posture just for a moment. Keep your heart open. Turn your gaze up just a little bit if that helps you. And relax. Thank you for joining me in that. When I was told that my topic would be loving the world, I said, oh, shoot. But I used the other word. You see, in my career and experience of being a chaplain, a hospice chaplain, and then a chaplain in a children's hospital, and before that, a street chaplain to the unhoused, when I think of the world, I don't think of love. I think of trauma. That's where my mind immediately goes to. And so I had to sit with that for a few days, maybe more than a few days. And eventually what came to me was hospitality, specifically the hospitality of food. Because in my country and in my culture, food is our primary love language. And so when Korean people, when we greet one another, instead of asking, how are you? How have you been? How are the kids? We ask, did you eat yet? Did you eat yet? 밥 먹었어? That's what we ask in a very informal way. 밥. Did you eat yet? 밥 is rice. Say 밥 with me. 밥. You didn't know you were going to get a language lesson today. 밥 is life. It is rice. And we ask, 밥, rice? 먹었어? Did you eat? And yes, that's me. In Korea. And that is the Honorable Palikut of SFTS. And I had the pleasure of taking her to Korea and showing her Korean hospitality. 밥 먹었어? Did you eat? That's how we greet each other. It carries the meaning, are you taking care of yourself? Did you meet your most basic need today? Because you are important. Your life is important, and it's worth preserving. In the morning, we ask, did you eat breakfast? In the afternoon, did you eat lunch? And in the evening, that's what I'm talking about. You would imagine, you might think that Korean people are obsessed with food. Are we obsessed with food? We are 100% obsessed with food. For many, many good reasons, but I'm going to give you two. First, Korean food is delicious. Whether it's traditional Korean food, 한식, or market food, if you've never been, I cannot describe it for you. It's like trying to describe the Grand Canyon. Whether it's street food, snack food, Korean pizza, Korean fried chicken, which, by the way, was taught to us by Black American GIs. But we took it and we made it our own. And we pair it with beer and soju. Right? Rice wine. And you can get any of these foods delivered to you anywhere you are. Even if you're sitting in a park, it will be delivered to you. That is how obsessed with food we are. But wouldn't you be obsessed with food too if you had a living memory of nearly starving to death? Or watching men, women, and children starve to death due to the ravages of war? 밥 먹었어? Did you eat yet? This greeting comes from the collective Korean experience of trauma, the trauma of war, the trauma of scarcity, of suffering, of pain, of death. It comes from a deep, empty belly. It's referred to as Han, this feeling, or Han. There's no direct translation for Han. I cannot translate it for you. I can only describe it for you. It's that sensation, that frustration, knowing that justice is slow. You know, and justice may want to flow like rivers, but the people who benefit and profit from injustice will build dams across those rivers. And we may not see justice in our lifetimes. And so that sense of frustration is what Han is like. It's like wearing a corset, and the unjust forces of the world are pulling those strings tighter and tighter so you can't breathe. And you have this sense of can't breathe. That's Han. If you watched your brother, your little brother, try to nurse at your mother's lifeless body, wouldn't you have a profoundly justice-leaning interpretation of Yeshua's words and command to feed the hungry, to feed the poor? This is a portrait, one of the many portraits of the prodigal son. Now, Mark Allen Powell was a former professor of New Testament, can you hear me? At Trinity Lutheran Seminary in Columbus, Ohio. And he had 12 students, and he had them read carefully from the Gospel of Luke, the prodigal son story, close the book, and then retell the story as faithfully as they could to a partner. Of the 12, 0 mentioned the famine in the story. Who here remembers the famine in the story? Yeah. 3 of you, 4 of you. Now, he found this fascinating. So he recreated this experiment with 100 participants. 100 participants. Same thing. Read the story, then tell it to a partner as faithfully as you can. Of the 100 participants, 6 mentioned the famine. Now, this group of 100, they were all ethnically, racially, socioeconomically, and religiously diverse. But they all had one thing in common. They were all from the United States of America. So when he had the opportunity to recreate this experiment overseas, he did, in St. Petersburg, Russia. Yeah, he gathered 50 participants, and he had them do the exact same thing, read the story, and then retell it to a partner as faithfully as possible. Of the 50 participants in Russia, an overwhelming 42 mentioned the famine. Only 6 didn't. Why? Because 70 years prior, just about 700,000 people died of famine as a result of a Nazi siege around the capital city of Leningrad, and it set off a 3-year famine. So famine was very much in the living memory and imagination of the Russian people. It wasn't an extraneous detail. It was critical to the story. Now, Powell called this famine blindness. I call it trauma blindness. There's a ton of trauma in the Bible. Not just famine, tons of trauma. But we don't like to talk about it. We don't like to preach about it. We don't like to teach about it. And my friends, if we don't teach about trauma, if we don't examine the trauma in the Bible and the trauma in our own lives, how are we going to testify to how great and good God's healing really is? Amen? Come on! And if we don't examine where we've been, the mess that our lives were, how can we tell people God is capable of taking us to where we're going to go? We have to look at trauma. That's why trauma is my jam. All right, so got me thinking, what other famine stories are there in the Bible? If we've been blind to the prodigal son, what else is there? Guess what? The first famine story is found in Genesis. Abraham's story. Anyone remember? Or yes, because you're doing all this justice Bible study stuff. Dr. Toll knows. First famine is with Abraham. It's so great that it forces them into Egypt. By the way, where he traffics Sarah for the first time to save his own skin, right? Trauma makes us do some crazy stuff and hurt other people around us. Second is in the days of Isaac, son of Abraham. Second son, by the way, because the first was Ishmael. We can't forget Ishmael. So we have a famine with Abraham and a famine with his son. There's some frequency here. Now this, representing the Exodus, it's not a famine story. It's about the deliverance out of Egypt, deliverance from slavery. But how did they end up slaves in the first place? One of the most amazing famine stories is that found in Egypt in the days of Joseph, son of Jacob, who was the son of Isaac. A famine with Abraham, a famine with Isaac, a famine with Jacob and Joseph. This trauma happens with great frequency in the Bible. And it is a trauma, let me tell you. Okay, now Joseph, because of his gift of dreams and interpreting dreams, is able to save a great many people from starvation, right? Because they collected grain. But he also devised a payment plan for that grain for every year of the famine until ultimately just about everybody in Egypt, including the Hebrews among them, became enslaved to Pharaoh. And all the wealth in Egypt came under one man, the Pharaoh. One man. And we have Joseph to thank for that. What? My hero Joseph with his Technicolor Dreamcoat? According to a report from the nonprofit organization Oxfam, an estimated $42 trillion in new wealth was generated in the first 2 years of the pandemic alone. Yeah. And about a third, or roughly 28 trillion, went to the richest 1% in the world. Billionaires in the United States became richer, and that is a tremendous transfer of wealth during a trauma, a global pandemic. Okay. For what reason does the story of Ruth begin in Moab? Famine in the land, you're getting it! You're getting it. In Naomi's hometown of Bethlehem, which is translated house of bread, there was a famine, and so it forced them to migrate. It forced them out. Now, during the pandemic, a friend of mine noticed, she lived in the Bay Area, and she noticed that people were driving into the hills in search of food. And so she set up a free food locker in front of her house, and she stocked it every day, and soon found that the need was greater than this one food locker could supply. So she started a nonprofit called Food is Free Bay Area. One of their programs is a gleaning initiative. If you have fruit trees, and in Northern California, chances are you have fruit trees, you can sign up to have volunteers come and harvest that fruit and get it to people in need of food. Now, how did Naomi and Ruth survive when they returned to Bethlehem? Gleaning, gleaning, gleaning. Yes, because it is written into the law. It's written into the law. They glean behind the harvesters. This is how widows could survive. Now, there were 2 famines during the time of King David. There was a severe famine in Samaria. There was a famine in the days of Elisha. When you look for this trauma, you're going to find it. And suddenly, eyes open. This is a trauma that occurs over and over again to these ancient peoples. And if you think it didn't mess with them, I got something to tell you. And there's more. These are more references to famines in the Bible. When you start looking for stuff, you're going to find it. But what about recent famines? We know of some, but did you know of this? 1865 to 1878, there was a huge famine in India. Huge. And they were a colony of England. And there were early reports of famine. But the British Parliament decided to do nothing. Apathy let this famine go on till 1878. There were 2 great famines in China, known as the Great Chinese Famine, both of them. First, in 1876, it began as a result of a climate crisis. There was a drought. The second, in 1958, and this was the result of Mao's great leap forward. He wanted to overinflate the success of his new program, so he had China export as much grain as possible to other countries to show off, while 45 million people starved. And during this time, there were mass reportings of cannibalism. It is still a taboo subject to this day. This is a memorial in Dublin to the Great Potato Famine. A professor in Glasgow did a comparison chart of censuses before and after the famine. In 1841, there were about 8 million Irish living, working, and 1,600 people in district asylums, 1,500 in workhouses and jails. This is 4 years before the famine. Nearly 50 years after the famine, the population had halved. There were 17,000 people in district asylums and 8,000 what they called lunatics at large, with a dramatic spike in those diagnosed with schizophrenia. Now, I want to stress for you that hunger, what we experienced last night waiting for dinner, you remember, hunger is not the same as starving or starvation. Let me tell it to you another way. This tick-tock, is not the same as this. Within days of not having any food to eat, our body starts to eat our own, energy stores. First, with glucose, the sugars. It moves on after the sugars to ketones produced in our liver. Then it moves on to fat, carbohydrates, and eventually moves on to muscle. When the body uses reserves and there's very little left, our hearts, our lungs, our ovaries, and for you gentlemen, your testes will shrink. Yeah, it shrinks. Our muscle mass decreases. Our body temperature drops, and then it becomes harder to concentrate. We become irritable. And when there's nothing left, our body will start eating muscle tissue, including the heart. And then at that point, we're close to death. But our body at this point is trying to protect the brain, right? It's trying to protect the brain, so it'll shut down major metabolic functions like our digestion. But eventually, the brain starts to shrink as well. And we worry for the children because A, they don't have the fat stores in their bodies, and B, their brains are just developing, and so we worry that functions that shut down may become permanent. Close to death, we start to hallucinate and we may have convulsions, heart palpitations, and rhythms become unusual, and then eventually the heart stops. Now, this is a comparison chart of symptoms of schizophrenia and symptoms of starvation. And I purposely left the labels off because they are so similar. The green represent same language, or red represents same language. Green, similar language, and the yellow, implied similarities. I'll have that for you later if you really want that list and the references from where I retrieved them. So I have to ask, is there a relationship between famine and starvation and schizophrenia, like they found in Ireland? Or more broadly, is there a relationship between trauma and mental illness? In my work with the unhoused in Northern California, I can tell you that 100% of them had trauma, whether it was childhood trauma or continuous repetitive trauma throughout their entire lives. And I got to register new unhoused people every year. And if you didn't have an overt mental illness before being unhoused, the trauma of being unhoused, you did within a month. You showed signs within a month, and I got to see it up close and personal. Now we know, because we have the data now, that there are epigenetic consequences. Epigenetic meaning there are changes in the cell, possibly changes in our DNA. Epigenetic consequences to the 6th generation after the first famine experience. So 6 generations later, we're seeing the consequences. We know this because we've got the data. But cruelly, we're going to continue to collect data because we've got famines going on. Where? Gaza, Palestine. We've got famines going on in Yemen. We've got famines going on in Somalia and southern Sudan. And if we're not careful, if we don't work to curb this inflation, this trickflation, the housing crisis, we're going to have starving people in the United States, not just food insecure, but starving people in the United States if we're not careful. And we already do. Yes, we already do. Presbyterian women, do your thing. Now, for many experts used to think that famine was a result of a shortfall in food availability, but now we know different. Amartya Sen, who is a philosopher and economist, published Poverty and Famine, an essay on entitlement and deprivation in 1981, and this study showed that famine occurs when food is available, but some groups do not have access to it. Irish potato famine, for example. There were other crops. They raised other crops, but the Irish were forbidden to eat anything but potatoes by their colonial masters, and everything else was exported out. In China, there was grain. There was no need for these people to starve to death, but the grain was exported out to show off. Today, we recognize that famines only happen with some human complicity. Yeah. Some analysts assert that famines are crimes of either commission, like in Leningrad when the Nazis sieged the city and used starvation as a weapon of war, crime of commission, or omission, like in India. We're just not going to do anything. Now, there are multiple causes of famine, and it usually starts with like a climate crisis, right? A drought or a flood. Maybe an economic shock, like sudden inflation. But it also has political factors too. And it could be the result of a violent conflict, which always leads to destruction of infrastructure and then the forced migration of peoples. And you get a bunch of people in a small space, in unsanitary conditions, and you've got disease, and you've got starvation, and you've got death. So, I have to ask, is famine caused by denying hospitality? I don't have to answer that. That's rhetorical. Because we know, Presbyterian women, you know that hospitality is more than good manners. It's more than please and thank you and doing a good deed. Hospitality in the ancient world was a moral imperative because they were living in a harsh desert climate and hospitality saved lives. Today, we live in a harsh economic climate and we need hospitality to save lives. It could be opening up your home, offering food or shelter for a day, a night, extended periods. For a full year, my family and I, we opened our home to our best friends, their teenage son, and a 65-pound Aussie doodle. Now, they were our best friends, so at times it was a lot of fun, but it was also hard. With a capital hard. It tested our friendship at times, and it tested what I thought I knew of hospitality. I did not know what I thought I knew. Can you imagine doing that to a perfect stranger, opening up your home? Because that's what they did in the ancient world. That was hospitality. It could be helping someone. Can you imagine paying for medical treatment, life-saving medical treatment, and paying for their recovery with today's prices? Right? Hospitality is not easy. Can you imagine hiding people in your attic from state-sanctioned violence? Can you imagine doing that? Even if it meant risking your life and the lives of your family members, your children. Hospitality is not easy. But as it was stated last night, it is necessary. Now, our theme, do all things in love, it got me thinking about hospitality. And it got me thinking about the agape feast that can also be found in 1 Corinthians. This is chapter 11. The agape feast was a communal meal. It wasn't just a piece of bread and some grape juice or wine. It was a communal meal. It was a potluck. We know what potluck is about. And Korean people, oh boy, we do it up. If you've never been to a Korean church and had a communal meal with Korean people, oh, girl. Like I said, it's like trying to describe the Grand Canyon. I can't do it. But this was a communal meal, and Paul was addressing this very diverse, stratified, socioeconomically stratified church to wait for each other before you eat, because some people who came later, maybe they had to work all day in the field and they couldn't make it early. They found that they had no access to the food because it was all gone. And some were lying drunk on the floor because they had drunk all the wine. They had no access. Hospitality, there was a lack of it there. But it got me thinking also about a beloved Korean dish called 부대찌개. 부대찌개. Say it with me. 부대찌개. Oh, one more time. 부대찌개. Okay, better. We'll work on that. 부대찌개 means military-based stew. This was the dish that was born out of the hospitality of American soldiers who offered up their rations to starving Korean people. This is a communal meal that saved people from starvation, and that is why Korean people love this dish so much. At the outbreak of the Korean War, Korean people had already been through decades of occupation and enslavement and oppression by the Japanese. Then, on top of that, was World War II. More devastation, more hunger. And then, the end of the war, only 4 years of no war. I can't say peace, because once Korea was liberated from Japanese occupation, they slipped right into the occupation of another foreign power, the United States of America. And for daring to resist and wanting to govern themselves, there was a massacre on Jeju Island. Over 30,000 Koreans killed. Then there was the Korean War. Oh my gosh. 3 to 4 million Korean people died. 6 to 7 million Korean people were made refugees. 8,500 factories were destroyed, 5,000 schools gone, 1,000 hospitals gone, 600,000 homes gone. The land was made inhospitable to agriculture. Food was scarce, and if it was not for the generosity and hospitality of individual soldiers sharing their rations, some people would have starved. They would have starved. Now, this was the first taste of canned meat that people had, right? And so children would often go scavenging in the garbage of these military bases because these soldiers who couldn't stand the taste were just throwing out their rations, right? They had so much. And then it was the women, Korean women, in their ingenuity, went onto these bases, found jobs as, laundresses, janitors, even sex workers. And what we're not going to do right now is judge sex workers and women who do what they need to do to survive during trauma and war, right? We're not going to judge them because what they did was they started the first black market that got these rations into the hands of starving Korean people. Rations like Spam, beloved Spam, if you've never had it, like I said, Grand Canyon. Hot dogs. I had one, and only one, craving during my pregnancy, and that was for Oscar Mayer wieners. Baked beans. Sliced processed cheese. We never had this before. Before 1987, Spam was only available on the black market and considered illegal in Korea. But now it is considered a luxury item. It is packaged like wine, like fine wine. And it's given to family members during Chuseok, our version of Thanksgiving. Yeah. Combined with other ingredients found in Korea, we have budae-jjigae.
South Korea's love of Spam began during the Korean War. While Koreans were starving and famine loomed, American soldiers were throwing out unwanted rations that included Spam, hot dogs, baked beans, and cheese. The taste of this canned meat would be known as miracle meat, not because it was magical, but because the gift of it, the hospitality of it, the taste of it revived a person's hope to survive one more day. Spam was American hospitality in a can. Budae-jjigae, or military-based stew, is the dish that was born out of the fusion of military rations and available Korean ingredients. Served family style, eating budae-jjigae is like gathering around for a communion meal or the agape feast attributed to 1 Corinthians. Paul exhorted the Corinthian congregation to wait for all to be assembled before sharing the food and drink together, so that no one went hungry. Hospitality is about access and making sure everyone has it because each life is precious and worth preserving. Hospitality grants access to resources that are life-sustaining and life-preserving. Hospitality can save a people from starvation and offer something that only a satisfied stomach can offer: joy in the moment and hope for tomorrow, a tomorrow that is better than yesterday. That is why South Korea loves this peculiar processed canned meat from America. That is why food is our primary love language. And that is why when we ask, "Did you eat yet?" It means I love you.
Yeah. Hospitality is how we love the world, but it is not easy. Because hospitality puts people over profits. Ever get in the way of somebody's money? Or a corporation's money? It is dangerous. It challenges unjust policies that might cut food stamps or deny children lunch at school. Children who are hungry, that might be their only meal that day. It will also confront unjust laws that make it illegal to feed the unhoused. There are cities with that law on the books, and St. Louis happens to be one of them. Now you know. Now, hospitality. When I say hospitality, hospitality doesn't ask, are you a Republican or a Democrat? Hospitality doesn't ask who's right and who's wrong. Hospitality doesn't ask, is it in the budget? Hospitality saves lives, and it's a moral imperative even today. Hospitality asks, did you eat yet? Did you eat yet? Doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, did you eat yet? And then we eat together. Let's pray. And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. All you need is love. All you need is love. All you need is love, love. Love is all you need. Together. All you need is love. Da, 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 da. All you need is love. Wah, 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 wah. All you need is love, love. All you need, love is all you need. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.